Okay, here's video number 3 in our series of Unit 2, Population. Today we're going to be talking about the major population concentrations in different regions of the world. Remember, regions is one of your 5 themes of geography. So first, we're going to start with East Asia. About 1.4 billion people, and remember, all population statistics are unreliable. So depending on the source, you can see China's population 1.4, 1.5, 1.35, but about 1.4 billion people living in China alone. When you add in the 2 Koreas, North and South, plus Japan, remember that Mongolia doesn't have very many people, only about 3 million, but with the 2 Koreas and Japan, plus China, you end up with almost 1/4 of Earth's human population in just East Asia alone. Japan and South Korea, though, are declining populations. Their populations are old and they're not having a lot of fertility. China famously restricted fertility during the one-child policy. They've now reversed that. In all 3 of these countries, the governments are now actively promoting people having larger family sizes. This population, with the exception of Japan and South Korea, is still remarkably rural. Most Chinese people live in rural villages or small towns. There are massive mega big cities in China, Shanghai, Beijing, Chongqing, really big populations, but most people in China are still rural farmers. Another huge population concentration in the world, South Asia. This is primarily India. India's population now exceeding 1.3 billion, probably closer to 1.4. India and China are on a course where just in a few more years, India's population will become bigger than China's population. And that is again because China has artificially restricted that population growth for so long that their population is no longer growing like India's is. India is still averaging just over 2 children per woman in total fertility rate. When you add in India's neighbors on either side, the countries of Pakistan and Bangladesh, both of those are big populations as well. So once you get India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, even Myanmar in South Asia, you're starting to see population that is again well in excess of 1.5 billion total, and this is another 1/4 of human population. Remember the circle in the other video where it said more people living inside the circle than people living outside of that circle. And that's why South Asia, East Asia, and then again, the third one now, Southeast Asia, which we'll talk about soon. That is also a big population. Like East Asia, South Asia's population is overwhelmingly rural. A lot of people make their living by agriculture. The third big concentration of people in the world, though, we're going to go to Europe. Altogether, Europe is getting close to 1 billion, somewhere between 750 million, maybe 800 million are living in European countries. Again, these population data statistics are unreliable. They're changing constantly. Every second in the world, 5 people are being born, 2 people are dying. So a lot of these numbers are algorithmic formulas because it would take forever just to count to 1 billion. So Great Britain, maybe 65 million people. Germany, 85 million. Russia, a little over 125 million. So if you add up all of these populations, you can see that Russia's population, it's actually been declining in the last couple of years. Italy, Spain, France, all of those countries, somewhere between 40, 50, 60 million or so. And again, these population statistics also a little bit off because you have to take into account migration. We're going to kind of push migration out to chapter 5 in David Palmer's Blue Book. We're not going to talk about migration until we get to those chapters, but it is important to realize that these data and these statistics, the quantifiable data, is again somewhat unreliable. One of your skills on the AP exam under quantifiable data or quantitative data is that you have to be able to explain the limitations of the data. And one thing you would say for population statistics is this data really the most recent, up-to-date, trustworthy data that we can use? Europe's population very different than South Asia or East Asia for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's much more urban. Number two, they're old. And remember, we said this in the other slideshow, old people tend to die way more frequently than anyone else. Young people, their lives are all ahead of them. Longevity all over the world is increasing because of better food, better sanitation, better health care, vaccinations. So in Europe, the elderly people are not having as many kids, and therefore, as they get older, some of these populations are starting to decline. We're going to talk about Denmark as a case study, Russia famously declining, Italy famously declining, France on the verge of declining. So we need to make sure we know that. Remember that I said also that Europe is much, much more urban. Yes, you can still find rural villages in France. Yes, you can find bucolic villages in Italy. But the reality is most Europeans are living in fairly large cities. The fourth cluster of population in the world, and this is a distant cluster, is in North America. Obviously, the United States is the most populous here. We're the third biggest country in the world by population. Only China and India are bigger. Indonesia, not far behind us in fourth. But the United States is a little over 325 million people. Of all of the rich countries in the world, we're the only one that is still really growing in any kind of significant way. We're typically mom, dad, 2 kids, and a dog. So really, immigration is what causes our growth. It's not so much fertility. Mexico, a little over 125 million. You got to remember, though, Europe's population is more than double this. And again, the big concentrations, East Asia, South Asia, over 1.5 billion each. In fact, if you look at Southeast Asia, that's actually more people than what you would see in North America anyway. So the eastern seaboard of the U.S. and Canada, we sometimes call this the Bosnawash corridor, or it's a megalopolis. Mega, of course, really, really big. Polis, that Greek root word for the city. So we talk about Boston, New York, Washington, D.C., plus Philadelphia, plus Baltimore, plus Hartford, Connecticut. Pretty much up and down that 95 corridor, there's one long, uninterrupted urban area. Southern California, you could almost say that you start to see that pattern between, say, LA and San Francisco, and even on down towards San Diego, but there are a bunch of places where that urban megalopolis is broken up. There's a kind of a small one if you think about West Palm, through Boca, into Fort Lauderdale, down through Hollywood, and then into Miami. Here's that Bosnawash picture, and you can see, again, up that I-95, across the Jersey Turnpike, up through New York City, headed out towards Boston. You can really see that phenomenon of population concentration. Don't forget the 2 words, density and distribution. Other clusters in the world, I mentioned Southeast Asia. This one really, if you think about it, could be that 4th big one. Because you've got Indonesia, almost 300 million. There should be an L there. The Philippines, over 100 million. Vietnam, pushing 100 million. Even countries like Thailand, Myanmar, Malaysia, all significant populations. And remember, these are populations that are still growing to some degree. And whereas China and India have slowed down their fertility as they've become more developed, these countries are still having family sizes slightly bigger than the world average. But regardless of religion, regardless of culture, regardless of ethnicity, most families are starting to buy into this idea of the 2-child family. And as more and more countries hit that target of a 2-child family, we're going to see that these populations are not growing that much anymore. Remember when I did the PIN code of the world population, 1114. Asia's the 4 billion. Asia's going to be 5 billion by the middle of the century. That population, again, not really growing that much. North America, South America together, only 1 billion, hardly growing at all. Europe, almost 1 billion, hardly growing at all. Remember, the big changer is going to be Africa. 1 billion now, tripling in population in your lifetime, and it's going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 billion. Good examples are countries like Nigeria. We'll talk about that in just a second. Nigeria is 200 million people. It's about physically the size of Texas, and it is averaging almost 4 children per woman. This is a population that is going to double, and it's going to double in your lifetime. There's going to be tremendous pressure for people to immigrate with an E out of Nigeria into either neighboring countries or, say, to Europe, which is closer than coming to another rich, developed part of the world like the United States or Canada or some of these other places. Generally, people that leave Nigeria, they're the most educated people. They're people who have an opportunity to leave. They're people who do have contacts, maybe family members somewhere else in the UK or in the United States. So we do see that there's already some migration out of Nigeria, but that pressure is gonna increase. Other countries in Africa with a lot of people, Ethiopia in East Africa, South Africa, a pretty big population. If you look at Kenya, a big growing population. If we go to South America, really Brazil is the only considerable population here. Remember, South America, something like 70% of it is the Amazon basin. And we don't live where it's too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry, and too rocky or too high in elevation. So, for example, if you go to Peru, Lima has 18 of Peru's 20 plus million people. Once you start going up towards Cusco and you're at 11, 12,000 feet, it's hard to breathe up there. When we took our spring break trip to Peru, we had kids on oxygen tanks because it's so difficult. If you're in Bolivia, if you're in, the Andes of Chile, this is why the populations of South America are not so high. Brazil, of course, does have a lot of people, right? And it's a big population. It's a very urban population. Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, big cities of 30, in excess of 20, 30 million people. So really, South America, the population is not all that much bigger than just the population of, say, the United States. Again, we don't live where it's too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry, too rocky. So what are the worldwide population trends? Real quick, I'll go through this statistic. The billions, you need to kind of know when the billions were hit. We didn't hit 1 billion people on Earth until 1820. By 100 years later, that figure had doubled to 2 billion. By the time I was born, it had doubled again, and it was 4 billion. And we were starting to get to the point where we were adding 1 billion about a little over every decade. When I was born in 1969, the Earth's population was not even yet 4 billion people. By the 80s, it had hit 5 billion. That's when I graduated high school, 87. By the turn of the century, Michael was born in 99, we had hit 6 billion. Today, that number is in excess of 7.5. I put a link in here. If you go to the Census Bureau's website, you can check out their pop clock, and it's going to show you probably somewhere around 7.6 billion. The first year I taught this class, world population was 6.2 billion people. We've added 1.5 billion people in my career here at Spanish River. Will it peak at 8, 9, 10, 12? Well, the UN says mid-century, we're probably somewhere around 9 to 10 billion, depending. Remember, I may not see that world of 10 billion because by 2050, I'd be 81. There's no guarantee I'm seeing 81. I'm going to assign you a homework assignment in a couple of days where I'm going to have you go out to a website. It's really cool. You put in your date of birth. It's going to tell you what number person you are in the world. So here's that, yardstick of all the billions. Great little line graph. It shows you the pacing. Notice the numbers might be slightly different because, again, population statistics unreliable. Malthus, Thomas Malthus, British clergyman, wrote a book, late 1700s, in which he talked about that the environment would not be able to keep up with the growing population. Population would grow exponentially. Food production would only grow linearly. This is kind of like Thanos in the Avengers Infinity War. When he gets power, immediately he starts killing half of all living things, all intelligent beings, because of the lack of resources. Malthus was all about that we're all going to die because there's going to be disease and starvation and all these problems because of too many people. Of course, Malthus's timing was totally wrong. He was born at a time right before the Industrial Revolution when agricultural productivity shot up tremendously, food production just really increased, better sanitation, better hygiene, better medical care. And so really, Malthus, not necessarily wrong about the idea of sustainability and the idea that you have to have a carrying capacity, but certainly wrong in terms of technology. The cornucopians today, they say, will always find a way to overcome the limitations of the environment. Remember, environmental determinism versus possibilism. All right? So the demographic accounting formula, the total population is the original population plus the births minus the deaths plus the immigration coming in minus the immigration going out. We won't talk about immigration until chapter 5, but we will start talking about births, deaths, and we're going to talk about crude birth rate, crude death rate. We'll talk about fertility, mortality. The slideshow's coming up. It's a lot of math, so get ready. Hope you enjoyed it. Keep listening, right? Follow Spatial Shark online, Twitter, and Instagram.